A session will be happening in Advi Baitak with the title AI and the New World Order. To please come towards the front of the stage. Um, and the session is about to start shortly. So. This session brings together Dr. Thomas Piketty, a French economist and professor at the Paris School of Economics in Industry and Financial Services. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Arif Habib Consultancy and Executive Vice Chairman of the MCB Arif Habib Savings and Investments. Widely respected in Pakistan's corporate and financial sectors, he has also served as the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Moderating today's discussion is Dr. Farah Said, Executive Director of the Mahbubul Haq Research Center and Associate Professor of Economics at LUMS University. A development economics, her research spans development and behavioral economics with a particular focus on poverty, gender.
So, according to the World Inequality Report, Pakistan's top 100 capture 42% of its total income, while the bottom 50% receive just 19%. The wealth disparity is even more stark. So, the richest 10% hold 59% of total wealth in Pakistan, and the top 1% account for about a quarter of Pakistan's wealth. Meanwhile, we're also a country of over 240 million people, where less than 10 million file taxes, and of which a conservative third file null or zero taxes. So we're not here to debate whether or not social inclusion is needed. What we are exploring today is how we go about it. I'll start with Professor Piketty first. So our panel has three components: tax justice, redistribution, and predistribution. And if you could please lay out for us what is it that tax justice
to do with the tax revenue, because ultimately the question of social justice has to be defined in terms of equal, it's just a tool among many other technical tools to try to get there, but in itself it's not good or bad. If you have an excellent tax justice system, but all what you do with the public money is not good, it's not a good system. So, and in fact, it's very difficult also to make it accepted and politically sustainable if, it really depends on the legitimacy of what you do. That being said, if we try to isolate the issue of tax justice, what's in tax. Now, one of the difficulties in the discussion of tax justice is that these two notions, tax justice with respect to income and tax justice with respect to wealth, are both important and relevant. And the true fair tax system, has to be a combination of the two. I think it has to be progressive with respect to income, it has to be progressive with respect to wealth. That's why we need a progressive income tax and a progressive wealth tax. And sometimes the discussion is there's a lot of confusion coming out from the fact that people are not talking about the same thing. And it's not incredibly complicated. We are not in rocket science technology, we are not in quantum mechanics, it's just basic economics and social science and political economy. But this distinction between income and wealth, so what you earn during a given year is income, what you own, all assets combined, is wealth. The development of the rule of law and a well-functioning political system in general. So in particular, in a country like Pakistan, there's a lot of concern that part of the economic activity is escaping taxation, that we don't know very well, for instance, the cadastre, who owns what in different parts of the country. I think VAT, income tax, system of taxation where you need to have a sophisticated accounting system, compute the profit, without even having the cadastre and the list of property which is different production units own. And one of my lessons from the history of taxation in Western countries is that things developed very gradually. And for instance, property taxation, was actually the main form of taxation in the United States or in Europe in the 19th century. And then when you have this very well-developed cadastre, because with property taxation, you really need to know who owns what, including very small owner, a very small shop, very small piece of land. Maybe they will pay a very small tax at the end, but even this very small tax allows you to develop this cadastre, this system of property registration, which then is very useful when you try to begin with. Then there's a risk that you end up in a system where, lots of people are just not paying anything. Then those who are paying are very unhappy. Everybody is very unhappy. The trust in the overall tax system is very low. And in the end, it is also the trust in government, because of course taxation, we know it from the French Revolution was about taxation. The US Revolution was about taxation. Every big country and development trajectory for a long time, unfortunately.
If I could just follow up and ask you to also explain the concept of predistribution, because I think the audience will be familiar with redistribution, but predistribution is not such a concept.
Yes, so this is, okay, you're right. So this term, I don't know. So just to take an example, if you increase the minimum wage, you can improve the pre-distribution, without tax and transfer. Now, of course, you cannot do it too much because at some point, if you multiply the minimum wage by 10, of course, you have a problem. But if you invest more in education, you can affect the two really come together, that you cannot just, in practice, some of the most progressive taxing, the country was, more productive than ever, the productivity gap with the rest of the world was the highest, because, you actually don't need extreme inequality to grow, and they had a huge educational advance over other countries and productivity advance, and that's much more important than having huge inequality. But the other thing is that the main effect of this very progressive tax rate at the time was actually an effect on the pre-distribution, in the sense that very, very high compensation, like, people getting, I don't know, $5 million a year or $10 million a year, they just disappeared of this enormous pay package. And then the opposite happened under Reagan. When Reagan cut the top income tax rate down to 28%, these people were able to bargain enormous pay package, but in both cases, this did not really make them more productive or less productive. It's just their bargaining power which changed, and so progressive taxation can also have this impact on bargaining power. So in the end, this also has an impact on the pre-distribution. So this is just saying with this example that some public policy are purely pre-distribution, some are purely...
Have not seen the type of growth inequality as explained by Professor Piketty in the R greater than G. An unequal society. Pakistan was born into inequality with a history of centuries of history behind us. So we are a class society where the extractive class has different sets of rules, everyone. Secondly, because of the inability or non-willingness to collect direct taxes, be it on income or wealth, the government of the day needs to resort to borrowing. And because of the debt creation of money, that puts more burden on the exchequer of the interest, and a higher need for debt, and that is highly inflationary. And we've like last few years we saw record inflation, but throughout Pakistan's history we've had high inflation rates, and that means there's a further tax on the poor. So we have what I say a double whammy in that sense, and to my mind it is the way to look at inequality in Pakistan is to look at the consumption of some basics by the poorest, whether it's nutrients or use of energy or access to, say, clean drinking water, which then causes all those diseases if you don't have access, versus the better off members of society where their nutrition intake is 50% better, their primary energy consumption is 200% better in terms of clean drinking water at the base level, at best 20% have it, and the higher levels. Because of not worrying about the productivity, we've ended up being highly import dependent, and therefore we've found ways and means of propping up our rupee with borrowed dollars. So we have an artificial exchange rate and have had it throughout. So with all of that, the only way to deal with it is to have universal basic income at a certain level, inflation linked, and so help the exports, which we are again very weak on. So all in all, my idea of universal basic income is the tool for deriving a sustainable growth, if I can put it that way.
And just to follow up on that very quickly, when So if there is a consumption-led growth, what does that mean for inequality? Would we keep the structure of inequality intact?
No, I'm not suggesting that. All I'm saying is when you start having better consumption levels, to me, the inequality is going down. The measure of, say, Gini coefficient, etc., are faulty in that, first, we don't really have a record of incomes, etc., etc., and that doesn't really tell us the story. The real story comes in from the basic consumption pattern of basics. And unless that gap is reduced, I don't think we can pull ourselves out of this problem. So while we will be doing that, in terms of really dealing with the sort of post-distribution inequality, yes, we need to spread the taxes. My first target would be to reduce the indirect taxes. See, right now, the collection of income of indirect, a good part of it is disguised as income tax withheld at source, which effectively turns into an indirect tax. And that's why I say the proportion, if you just look at otherwise what is the standard definition of indirect tax, it's much higher in Pakistan when we look at our numbers. So that is the thing I would attack, is the indirect taxes have to reduce.
So let me now follow up on something that both of you have highlighted, which is extraction and bargaining power of the elite. So Professor Piketty, you've written in Capital and Ideology that inequality is a political construct. It's not natural. You talk about the case of Sweden, which went from one of the most unequal societies in 1910 to one of the most equal ones in 1970 through progressive taxation. So the political economy question that comes to my mind is, who will force this change in Pakistan? Political parties are controlled by the wealthy. They're not going to volunteer to tax themselves. The poor are largely not organized. So where does the political force behind this change come from? And must we wait for a catastrophe to happen for that change to happen as well?
Yeah, if the poor don't get organized and the middle don't get organized and only the rich are organized, then this is not going to work, that's for sure. So you know, the obvious strategy and what has worked historically is to get organized. And so you mentioned the case of Sweden. I just want to say a few additional words about the story of Sweden, because it's not so well known. You know, sometimes people imagine that countries in Nordic Europe, you know, have always been egalitarian, that this is part of their eternal culture, and you know, there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do to do like them, or maybe in fact we don't even want to be Swedes because they have a strange culture and we don't want to be like them. So, you know, sometimes people describe this as a sort of cultural permanent issue. But it's not at all the story of Sweden. So let me just say a few words on the political system and sort of the very extreme entrenched inequality that existed in Sweden just 100 years ago. You know, much more political inequality than in Pakistan today. Much more. So here are the basics of the political system in Sweden that was until World War I, and until, in fact, 1920. So first of all, until World War I in Sweden, only the top 20% taxpayers could vote, top 20% richest taxpayer, top 20% richest men, of course, women could not vote, and so you had to have enough property to vote. But that's very common in 19th century Europe. You know, that's what you have everywhere in 19th century Europe. And the only difference in Sweden is first that it continued until World War I. But the main difference, the second and most important difference, is that it was much more sophisticated than this. So in Sweden, until World War I, within the top 20%, you had a different number of voting rights depending on how wealthy you are. And depending on the property you have and the amount of property tax you pay. And you had between 1 and 100 votes, you know, depending on how wealthy you are. And so that was for legislative election. In municipal election, there was no upper ceiling on the number of votes you could have, so your number was one, also on the basis of their assets in the municipality. So, this is something, multinationals today in Pakistan or in India, they would love a system like this. And sometimes they find other ways, to get the people they want in power. But, they would not even dare asking a political system like this. Because, today, if you come in 2026 and say, okay, this is the electoral system I want, people would say, look, this is too much, you cannot ask for that. This was Sweden until 1920. And so what happened? That's the interesting part of the story, is how do you get out of such a system of entrenched inequality? First, let me tell you, everything I've just told you, this is not fake news. No, this is completely real, and at the time, nobody was ashamed of it, and you have archival material, you have quantitative research using this data with the voting rights proportional to your wealth, looking at these dozens of municipalities where only one individual. So, if a system like this was in place today, in West Africa or in Pakistan, people in the north will say, oh, this is, corruption of the south, these brown people have always been corrupted. Okay, this was Sweden, until 1920. So lesson number one is the imagination of elite to design institutions to stay in power is limitless. There's no limit. When you have power, you are ready to design institutions which go very, very far. And in that sense, Pakistan today is like the land of equality, as compared to these political rules in Sweden. Now, the second lesson is that these rules were defeated. And the country changed. So what happened? How did it? Well, we are back to working class mobilization. Because it did not happen just like this, one day the elite say, oh, we want to give up power. In fact, we are nice people, we are tired to be the chief, we are going to agree to give you. Of course not. This would never happen like this. It did not happen with the Swedish elite, it did not happen with the French aristocracy, it did not, it never happens like this. What happened is that there was a big fight. So you had working class mobilization, very powerful trade union movement, very powerful social democratic party, and they had big demonstration. In the end, they fought for universal suffrage. Then they won election in 1932 for the first time. They took power. They stayed in power for several decades. They put the state capacity of the country to the service of a completely different project. So basically, you had this system of registration of property and wealth, which I was referring to before, but which was used before them to distribute voting rights in proportion to wealth. Now they used it to make people pay high progressive tax in proportion to wealth, to pay for public services in education and health, which are not perfect. We've seen with COVID crisis the limit, but which were much better than any other system before and much better than any other system we've seen after that. So this is just to say that, the historical record is showing us that very powerful entrenched elites can be defeated through mass mobilization. Now, is it simple? Was it simple at the time? Is it going to be simple in the future? Of course not. It's always very complicated, and I should say, today, what's very difficult, of course, for a country like Pakistan or for any country in the global south is that you have these countries in the global north, which Sweden did not have a global north at the time, but today you have these countries in the global north who have put in place historically a system of colonial extraction, but today a system of financial opacity, free capital mobility in order to get the wealthy Pakistanis or West African put their money in a bank in London or in France whenever they want, and then these people from the north, government from the north, they give lessons to the south about what to do, but they contribute to the system of financial opacity, tax haven, tax evasion, which makes it very difficult for a country like Pakistan or any poor country in the south to build a system of tax justice when you have, it's so easy to push a button, send your money to Dubai or to London or wherever, and then you have no cooperation from the global north to try to set up the system. So there's a lot of hypocrisy with countries who are pretending sometimes to pay for development aid, but then are getting extract profits and capital income. The outflow of capital income and profits coming from the global south today is much, much larger than the foreign development aid that's supposed to go in the other direction, and which sometimes is just paying the Western consultant rather than giving money to the poor in the global south. So it's in a way it's even more difficult today for a developing country to get this kind of mobilization and institutional change than it was for the some countries in the global north 100 years ago. So it is complicated. I'm not trying to say, but I think we can still try to learn from this experiment and try then to build coalition. That's the only strength of the poor is their number. They have to build coalition to change the system and be more imaginative than the elite in terms of institution building and change the rules of the game and the rules of the division of power in the end.
Thank you. Biggs, I have a similar question to you. You've been on the Economic Advisory Council as well. You worked with the elite of Pakistan, the wealthy and the powerful, in some sense. So your insights on, and I would hate it if someone were to ask me this question, but what is the one thing that you would recommend for the change that you are proposing? Not the whole program, but just let's say an important first step that they must take to move towards this UBI.
Before I answer that, a very quick thing that the political structure and why would it allow it, my answer is it's now been over 25 years that we've had, albeit a means-tested income support program in place. And we've had a left-leaning government, a right-leaning government, somewhere in between political government, and now a hybrid government. All of them have gradually increased the budget allocation for it. Minimum wage laws brought in. They don't work in Pakistan because the number of jobs we create is far below the number of people who come into the workforce, and therefore they're forced to work for a pittance of the minimum wage, and who's going to complain, if I'm getting a quarter of the minimum wage, and I'm grateful for it. I'm not to go around complaining about it to officialdom for that matter. So that process is already in place. It's the force of circumstances which will get the governments to start thinking beyond means testing. It's a matter of time, in my opinion. To get it going, I would probably try and convince the government to pick 4, 5 to 10 of the poorest districts in Pakistan and bring in basic income, not means tested, for the people of that district and see the results.
Sorry, can I ask you, I'm very curious to know more. So can you remind me the amount, today in terms of in this means-tested program, how many people get how much per month through this program? And in your proposed system of universal basic income, how this will be different? So what will be the amount and for how many people?
The income support that the people are getting is, I would say, roughly 1/10 of the minimum wage. My proposal is to be at half the minimum wage, but start at half of that. So at about 25% of the minimum wage is what I would like to roll out, and roll it out growing at a rate where it will take us 7 years to get there, because in my opinion, that's the time we will need for domestic productivity to catch up. Otherwise, there'll be, again, bouts of inflation or resorting to imports which we can ill afford. So that's my thought on it. In terms of the budgetary allocation, just to give you a fair idea, our total tax collection last year was 12 trillion rupees, and the budget allocation for this support program is just over 500 billion rupees, while we paid interest, the government paid interest of 9 trillion rupees. To my mind, the biggest flaw in our economic structure is the debt creation of money and the fractional reserve banking, which effectively transfers wealth from the poorest through inflation, etc., and the indirect taxes to the few who are beneficiaries of that are.
Sorry if I may, because I want to better understand. This is really seems very convincing and really fascinating to me, but I want to better understand. So you would go, right now the means-tested transfer are about 10% of minimum wage. You want to bring them to 25 and then to 50% of minimum wage for all the population?
Sorry. No, I would say 25 of the desired rate right now. So if I want to be at 50, it's at 12.5%. So, and then grow it over 7-year period.
To 50%. And so when it's grown to 50% of minimum wage, and also extended to the entire population rather than just the poor today, the total cost of the program in your simulation, how much as a percentage of GDP does it cost today, and how much would it cost at the end?
Okay. So as I said, today the non-means is a little under $500 billion rupees.
As a percentage of GDP.
Okay,
because
okay, but a fraction of our total spending. While if ideally I would do away with the debt creation of money and the government have and using all the modern data that capacity you have is for the government to just grow the money in circulation in line with the growth in the GDP and therefore be not non-inflationary and of course you're not enriching the lending class, but that would more than suffice the full payment is what I'm saying of the 50%. The benefit of course of that is we also have another very serious problem is the gender discrimination and discrimination against the minorities. So all of that gets taken care of because amongst the recipients of the basic income would be women as well. So that's perhaps the easiest tool to empower women as well and the minorities, which otherwise is just not happening in the cultural bind we are in Pakistan.
Look, I'm all in favor of it, and I just want to see the kind of progressive, taxation of wealth and income that we need to pay for it. So, at the end of the process, okay, you have increased GDP thanks to the reform, and that's fantastic, but you still have to pay for this universal basic income equal to 50% of minimum wage. So I'm just asking, approximately, in your system, how much would it cost as a percentage of GDP at the end of the process?
Okay. At this stage of the percent of GDP, my own very rough calculation is that we would be spending about 2% of the GDP on basic income.
Okay, yeah. And so this when you say we will reduce indirect tax initially, you will have to increase some other tax, and so what will be the tax that will pay for that?
No, my view is slightly different. First of all, it is as we mature and go forward, there is a great emphasis on increasing the share of direct taxes. There is already a move, and it is slow, it's painful, it's a lot of corrupt practices within the tax collection mechanism. So it's a slow process. But ideally, our direct tax collection should be more like 70% and 30% indirect. Right now, it's the reverse. So we need to travel that distance. I can't have a solution for it overnight.
Okay, no, but this looks like a perfect plan to me. I mean, I just wanted to make sure I understand. But yeah, no, this is pretty convincing.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
I believe, thank you. I believe, Eksaab, you he proposes subsidies, cutting subsidies and reallocating development expenditure more than, if I read your
okay, yes.
writing correctly.
But that's related to the subsidies currently directed as social support, and we've just done away with one particular entity, which was the I don't know, the shops that sell basic food items at I forget what the name is. But so there's a lot of subsidies and there is a lot of leakages in those, and each level of subsidy gets misused, and also there's market distortion because of each of those. So by doing away with those and just making one direct transfer, you deal with the market distortions, you deal with the leakages, and you do away with those subsidies as a deliberate policy, not necessarily to merely finance it.
Thank you so much. So I'm very conscious that we should go to the audience for questions. I do want to quickly summarize. It's been, as I said, set expectations early on that this is going to be an interesting conversation. I think both our panelists have fundamentally rejected trickle-down economics, but they have very different approaches to how we can have an inclusive society. So with that, we have about 15 minutes. Let's take maybe 3 questions. If you can please introduce yourself very quickly and have a very brief question.
Hello.
My name is Khalid Mahmood and I am the labor rights activist. Interesting to know that the redistribution thing that was explained and the example of the Swedish society. But that was a revolution kind of a thing in Sweden. When the workers were organized in trade unions and they were able to bargain collectively. In societies like Pakistan, where the repressive political system that we call hybrid regime now has been existing since last many years, and the decision makers are not willing to allow workers to organize in trade unions or the informal economy workers to organize themselves. How, if we are not able to bargain collectively, then even the idea of universal basic income is not going to be implemented, I think. The problem here lies in the political setup, which determines that the people will have only survival wages. They will have only subsidies on which they can survive. So without changing the political system, I think.
Well, as much as we might desire to change the political system, the way the class structure is, I don't see it as a very likely thing happening, especially as you rightly put it, people are not allowed to form unions or anything of that sort. So it is ultimately the force of circumstances, and as I mentioned, the income support program started 25 years ago as a basically a force of circumstances. It's been increased significantly since then by other governments, not the one that started it out, and it's a thing of warding off the potential revolt or revolution. So it's a quiet revolution that would creep in unwittingly for those in power, but it will become the need of the hour for them. They will have no choice but to continue increasing the size of the income support, and at some stage it will become unmanageable, and therefore means testing would be inefficient and you'll have to give up on means testing. That is my route to it, or hope to it.
Maybe just to say a word on this, I think in practice, at least if you look at the historical record, you know, change in economic rules and change in the political system usually come together, and you have to fight for both at the same time. So, you know, I gave the example of Sweden earlier, where it was really a complete transformation in the rules of the game politically, who has the power, which came together with the change of the tax system. And the change in the tax system, I sort of agree with you that it would not have been possible without changing the political rules. And it was the same, if you think of, Britain, the House of Lords lost their power and disappeared. Well, they are still there, but they lost their power in 1910. At the same time, they lost the battle over progressive taxation and the people's budget of 1910. So there was a big fight, which was both about a substantial fiscal and socio-economic issue and about the change in the institution, which is that the Lords lost completely their veto power on budget forever, and they never took it back. Now, I have one question for you, which is that in the case of Pakistan, what will be the sort of one change in the political system that is the most important? Because you cannot get rid of the House of Lords because you don't have an House of Lords, at least officially. So what will be the one change? Yeah.
Allow people to organize, allow people to raise voice for their rights. I mean, we are under a very repressive regime since last many years. And these are the same people ruling us from different parties, on the platform of different parties, and one constant factor is the military regime. We have the right to decide for their fate. They are the ones who should be able to organize, and like in Sweden, the trade unions developed the Social Democratic Party and they captured the power and they changed the system. Why can't we do it here?
So may I try and answer that?
So it's a right to form union, yeah. So it's a restriction.
You have to wrest away power, no one hands it to you. So you have to look at the other way around. It's the people who have to wrest away power from the powerful, not that the powerful will hand you down and allow you this and allow you that. That's not going to happen.
Can I? Okay. My name is Saulat Salahuddin and I run a manufacturing concern. My question is, looking at the title, Why Tax Justice in Pakistan, there is tax injustice. Basically, only 1.6% of the people are the taxpayers, and as Dr. Piketty mentioned, that we have moved very fast and quickly on the indirect taxes. One thing that we need to think about, and this is for you, Mr. Beg, why aren't we implementing wealth tax? If we have to learn from the countries that have succeeded, we are putting all the focus on the indirect taxes and income tax of 1.5% of the people who are contributing. We are not widening the base, and we are not talking about wealth tax. This has to increase. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, there are thoughts on that. First of all, we did have a wealth tax, which was removed under military dictator's regime in the 2000s. We had inheritance tax prior to that, and the Islamic courts were used to kill that. We started life on the Income Tax Act by adopting the 1922 income tax of India, and all of that has been changed by subsequent governments in Pakistan over the years. So as much as I am in favor of wealth tax, and I wrote about this umpteen years ago, I think a brief article back in 1992, but the fact remains that those very people who would have to pay a significant share of that tax are not going to do it. It is for the rest of society to raise enough of a voice and create this situation. While you say 40% of whoever pays tax, every Pakistani pays that indirect tax. Please bear that in mind. It's painful, but that's the honest truth.
Actually, if we consider tariff as a form of tax, if we consider tariffs as a form of tax and the global supply chain, when we say tax justice, how can you explain that in today's world, a justice without an international moratorium can influence the political economy in a certain country?
I'm not sure I understood the end of the question. About tariffs?
Actually, tariffs.
Yeah.
Because currently we are in an era of supply chain connectivity. So economies fail if the supply chain is disconnected. So tariffs is what determine that at what cost it is going to be produced and to be sold. If we do not have an international moratorium and arrangement of justice on tariffs, any national political economy, how can it handle it? Will you respond to it?
Yes, so I agree with you. I mean, and as you know, there's one country in the world today which is using tariffs all over the place, and they seem to have, to enjoy it, or at least, the president of this country seems to have a lot of fun announcing new tariff every morning. I think at some point there will be, I hope, in my ideal tax system or organization of the world economy, there should be coalition of countries which set rules about trade where, you can have tariffs when there are good reasons for that, in particular if you have a very polluting production or exploitation of labor and you don't follow certain rules, that's fine. Reduce your carbon emissions, otherwise you will be the one paying tariffs. And the good news is that the share of the US in world GDP is going down and down. It used to be 40% in 1950, it's 15% today, and it's going to be 5% by the end of the century. And so, they are getting very nervous today because they know that they are losing control and power. But this is not the end of the story. But in the meantime, some countries will have to adapt to this. I mean, in the case of tariffs imposed to Pakistan, for instance, I think in the end it will be mostly the US consumers that will pay for it, but I think it might also hurt some people in Pakistan, of course.
So I've been told we have just 2 minutes. I want to take one question,
Yeah.
and then
Thank
we'll conclude.
you. My name is Amina Babar, and I'm a student at Trinity School. So I was just wondering that in your work, and also when you were talking about Sweden's example, and how a lot of the inequality that reduced was because of the World War, and there was basically there were shocks like wars and such that actually led to that decline in inequality. To what extent do you think that these peacetime pathways, so for example, more income support and more sort of fair inheritance tax laws and all, can actually be realistic or more viable solutions to again replicate those historically equalizing moments, if you will? Or if you think that again a war like World War I is more likely to bring about that decrease in inequality, if you will?
Well, I don't think you need another World War I or World War II to reduce inequality. But I think, we need probably, political shocks, and, I think the consequences of global warming and, climate catastrophe, unfortunately, are going to be part of the shocks in the coming years, which will change people's attitudes toward the kind of capitalist system and economic system we have today. Because I think, as the situation gets more and more difficult on this front, I think attitudes will start, attitudes toward billionaires who take private jet and at the same time give lessons to the rest of the planet about what to do. I think people will not find this funny anymore. I think many people already don't find this very funny, but I think at some point people will get really angry at this. So I think that will be one of the forces of transformation. But now we cannot just wait, for a climate catastrophe or social catastrophe or military catastrophe to happen for the change. I think what's very important is to look at the kind of grassroots mobilization, and of course the right to mobilize through the creation of unions and new political parties is absolutely central. But we have also to see within existing political parties you know, how to change their platform from the inside. I mean, I'm not saying that's easy. I know, you know, in Pakistan, you know, there's a lot of, you know, angriness and deception, to say the least, about the existing traditional parties. But, you know, I think if I look at the situation in my country, in France, you know, there's a long tradition of creating new political parties all the time, which is very good and very, you know, lively in many ways. But, you know, at some point, yeah, you know, we also have to change the system from the inside and the parties from the inside. And, you know, it's too easy to be disappointed in democratic politics. You know, we're always disappointed by electoral politics, but you know, at the end of the day, there's no other way than to try to reinvest this arena and make the people, you know, accountable and change their platform and fight for, you know, getting the change delivered. So, you know, we are all together in this, and, you know, I think looking at past experiences make me hopeful for the following, because there's been huge transformation in the past which, you know, the elite did not want to hear about this transformation, but they did happen, so this makes me hopeful. But it always took enormous mobilization, so, you know, we all have to try to play our part.
We have to make way for the next session, like, as interesting as this has been. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you also to all of you for participating.